about Donald Gillies' paper. It seems to me that the kind of empiricism about logic that the prologue example supports is rather anodyne, in the sense that even a very hardline supporter of rationalism and a priority about logic could be quite comfortably accept the example, because, well, I mean, to take an analogy, suppose that somebody argued that relativistic physics was not universal because there are all sorts of technological applications in which it's more efficient to use Newtonian physics. That would really seem to be missing the point, because although of course it's true that there are these cases where we're just going to use Newtonian physics, that does nothing to show that relativistic physics isn't universally true. And it seems to me that there's a similar distinction to be drawn in the case of logic. Of course, if we just think of logic as giving us advice about what the most efficient ways to reason with various problems are, then it's totally unsurprising that it's an empirical matter which forms of reasoning are cognitively most efficient for given problems. But a hardline defender of rationalism about logic is going to say that there's also a question about the universal truth of logical principles and the truth-preservingness of rules of inference. And that's a different matter from which forms of reasoning is practically most efficient to use, so that you can think both that the principles of classical logic are absolutely, exceptionlessly and necessarily true and know them a priori and so on, but also think that of course there are that has no immediate implications for what the most efficient ways of solving a practical problem are. So I don't really see the prologue example as a threat to hardline rationalism about logic.
I think we tackle that question, and then the speakers can reply to discuss something.
Yes, well, I completely agree with this remark, and just a small addition. So it seems to me that the person who gives this example of the prologue would also agree probably that, well, what I mean is that given the database, given this timetable, there is no train. But that, of course, you would also agree that, well, if the timetable changes and so on, then there will be another answer. So, in person, one needs this ordinary knot in the following way, that one wants to say, well, according to the timetable as it was at that time, there was no train at 9:30, but according to the timetable the changed one, there is of course one. So one needs this ordinary knot in order to just solve very ordinary common distinction that we need to make. So it seems to me that I would like to see a more genuine example about what we say that empirical situation, or the empirical factors changes this logic.
rationalists. Well, the point is that rationalism, in view of these the basic objection is the prologue counter-example is not very convincing. So if I take Tim Williamson's point, he compares it to saying that, look, we use Newtonian mechanics in a certain circumstance, even though we know that relativity is correct. But I don't think that's quite analogous. When we use prologue, reasoning about timetables, it's not because we think that classical logic is really correct for this example, it's the appropriate one to use. And this, however, prologue works approximately. It's a different situation from the one in which classical logic applies. If we apply classical logic, we just get the wrong result. And so we have to reason because we're reasoning in a situation of uncertainty. So it's not that classical logic applies is the really underlying logic, and prologue is just an approximation. It's not like the Newton-Einstein case. It's really that this logic, which applies to these uncertain situations, is the appropriate one in that context. So that's the reason why I think that the prologue example is a good one, but clearly two people think it isn't convincing, so I don't think I've convinced it. Okay?
Do you have any comments about discussing?
Or about discussing? Yes, well, I think perhaps I like what discussing said very much. The only thing is I felt he might have been a bit too kind to me, maybe more errors in the paper. However, one thing that I thought was very interesting, well, a number of things that were very interesting. One was his quotation from Feyerabend in 1966. I think Feyerabend's contributions to the philosophy of quantum mechanics are rather forgotten. Maybe because they're so kind of rational, and we associate Feyerabend with an irrational position. But I think Feyerabend has been borne out in a way. His point is that the difficulty with changing the logic in the quantum mechanics case is you're just sweeping the difficulties under the carpet. Whereas you want to give an interpretation which will lead to new predictions. And I think he was borne out. You mentioned very recent developments, but my earlier developments did bear him out there because the hidden variables interpretation led to the aspect experiment, and this was carried out. The hidden variable theorists predicted one result, and the Copenhagen people the other, and actually it turned out the Copenhagen people were correct. The surprise of most of the people I knew who were supporting hidden variables at that time. So I think that doesn't bear out Feyerabend very much. Whereas if physicists had just accepted quantum logic, I don't think it could have led to an interesting experiment along those lines. Whereas, again, to make a contrast with AI, you can actually, these AI people just put in new logics and try them out and see which one works best. I mean, they literally do that, and then they implement the logic which really works best in that situation. So that's what I'm trying to on that one. But perhaps I should stop, and maybe we'll have a discussion of the other thing. Oh yes, I want to reply. Yes.
Well, I noticed that in your comment you treated the terms correct of the logic and the appropriate one to use as interchangeable, and that's to ignore exactly with the distinction which is crucial to understanding the hardline rationalist's point. By the way, I'm not a hardline rationalist myself. I'm just pointing out that the example is not a problem for hardline rationalism. The hardline rationalist, and actually to this extent, it seems to me they're right. I was going to distinguish between the question of which principles it's appropriate to use in reasoning. In other words, which kind of inferential moves one should make, and which logic is, if any, is universally true or truth preserving. And after all, if you think that classical logic is universally correct, it does not mean that you think that the only forms of reasoning we should use are deductive. You can be think that classical logic is perfectly true, and at the same time think that it's very often, in fact maybe always, appropriate to use, perhaps apart from some of its mathematics, appropriate to use non-deductive forms of reasoning as well. And so the fact that it's appropriate to do non-monotonic reasoning in solving a certain problem has nothing to do with the question of whether the principles of classical logic are universally correct. And I think it's absolutely crucial to understanding the hardline rationalist position that when you formulate a principle like monotonicity, the turnstile in that principle has to be properly interpreted, and the proper interpretation of the turnstile, in the sense in which the hardline rationalist defender of classical logic is going to take it, accept monotonicity, is not going to be anything to do with what kinds of reasoning you should in fact perform in order to be most efficient. It's just going to have to do with what forms of reasoning are truth-preserving, and the prologue example shows nothing at all about that. And it seems to me that one person who's made a lot of this distinction between logic as a theoretical discipline, roughly speaking, the one that gives us universal laws of truth or something like that, and the practical matters of what is efficient reasoning is Harman. And I mean, he's arguing quite powerfully that the two are actually very, very far apart, and that's a distinction that the hardline rationalist is going to insist on.
Shall we continue the discussion? Well, I think we are.
Melissa raised an interesting point by mentioning Roosevelt. So while I granted that there can be evolutionary meaningful connections between our species and other species as to emotions, and when we go through morality there is a big gap, Nussbaum says something like, even to have emotions in the full logic sense, you need a conceptual system. And the example is like shame. In order to have shame, you need conceptual language and blah, blah, blah. And I agree with that. But still, I think that we can make a distinction among emotions. So, a little kid, 2 years old, I think wouldn't be ashamed if he's named here. But I think he or she would be fearful if there is something dangerous. And the same would be for an animal, and the same would be for us. So if when we go to more basic emotions like fear, or that's I think a very good thing. There could be others, but fear is very clear to me that there is a phylogenetic connection that is very strong. So I would grant the point about some emotions, but not about all emotions.
Yes, I just wanted to ask the following question to Steve. The thing is, I fully agree with you that to try and reduce all our moral life to biology and Darwin isn't going to work, because there have been enormous changes in moral attitudes apart from anything. I mean, if 2,000 years ago it had been in Rome, there would have been gladiatorial displays and all these kind of things, which I think nowadays most people, perhaps not everyone, would regard as morally unacceptable. So there is that difficulty, but on the other hand, there is an interesting passage in Hume, when he discusses the difference between ancient morality and modern morality, and points out how different it is. But he says that still you can trace it all back to some underlying sort of principles that are the same, even though Romans and for him modern Europeans have different moral ideas. So what I wonder wondered is whether there might be I mean, these people like oral morals, a bit naive, could there be a more sophisticated theory where you try and somehow you trace things back to evolutionary impulses and instincts, but in a somewhat more indirect way. So I just wondered, there are underlying principles, but somehow they get a bit changed in different social settings. What you felt about that?
I think we have a good example of this. Is Max Hauser's theory. Max Hauser has this idea that there are moral universals in the same sense in which there is the universal grammar for Chomsky. This is an interesting idea. But still, I think there are differences there because there is no poverty of the stimulus argument for him like there was for Chomsky and other difficulties. But the main difficulties I find there that he cannot really account for normativity. My main argument was, I gave the argument you repeated, but my main argument was that there is this normative detachment from our instincts and emotional reactions that needs concepts and the possibility of a normative detachment. That's what I think is necessary. The possibility of a normative detachment, and this I don't think can be rooted. This can be rooted phylogenetically, but as such in the evolutionary story. So I don't know if you see this point because you said I agree with you because if you root like the idea that the examples that Hauser gives are very controversial. I think one is, for example, respect the others as you want to be respected. This, in his opinion, is an example of a moral universal. The point is to tell the others. If you were in the ancient Rome, for example, or in the ancient Greece, Aristotle wrote that slavery is justified when a slave is a Persian or barbarian, but not when they are not others. That is to be respected. The others are only Greeks. So this universal principle had to be interpreted so vaguely that the normative component is really missing. Well, if he says, all cultures share this universal, it depends how you interpret it. So there is no universal in this sense, the evolutionary sense. This is another objection. So two objections to Hauser. One is the normative component, the other where are the universal that should be originated by our evolutionary story.
I have a question for Maria Beccara. It's a sort of technical question about your critics of the next paper. Of course, I agree with the criticism. And the question is on the meaning of fMRI measurement. I mean, at the moment, the state of art is that we can detect if a group of neurons, they absorb more blood or less. So the same thing here. Measuring the current, I can say it's on or off, but it's very rough. So, what's your opinion about the real meaning to give to this kind of measurement? If there is a way to, we can improve, not say to detect the code of neurons, but you need some precise measurement. Or if you have any suggestion to different kind of experiment, not to solve the problem, of course, but to help for understanding. Yes, the real meaning to give to the measurement of the absorption of energy of blood, just in some part of the brain, without knowing anything of what's really is happening inside.
So you're even more harsher than me on the interpretation. I'm happy to grant your point. It's difficult to understand what the status, methodological status of this research are, even if I don't want to be too harsh. I think they are very interesting in many respects. We have the glorious tradition of the neuroneurons that, when we go to America, area don't exist, but in Europe are very much respected. This is interesting to discuss. Sorry, so I agree with you on that. It's a methodological problem, and I don't have any good answer to what exactly this activation means. I think it's the correspondence also. You need to explore more the philosophy of mind that is the basis of this kind of research. When you want to discuss, mental event, complicated, complex mental events like thoughts or higher emotions. So I agree with you. And for Gillis, another example of how that I think will help. Another universal it gives is this: don't do adultery. Okay, don't do adultery. This is universal for them. My point is, why I see it universal? Because people do adultery. Not here, of course, but there are others outside that do adultery. The point is, if this is a universal, it's intrinsically normal, because it's not a description of what happens or what should happen. My point is, though, if the universal are taken that way, they incorporate the normativity they should explain. So this is the second objective. The first one is that I doubt that there are universal as strong as it thinks across all of human culture, starting the last 5,000 years. And the second one is, if you want to explain normativity with this kind of things, the only attempt you can make is to use the whole idea of dispositions. But I think Kripke is right. You cannot reduce normativity to dispositions. So it doesn't have mind. People have the tendency to accept this idea. You shouldn't do adultery, and they do. So I don't think it really there's much in outsiders. It's not very promising, and it's the best theory in that sense, I think.
Any more questions?